I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Matt Savoca of Hopkins Marine Station, Stanford University. And he's going to talk about baleen whale prey consumption and its effects on marine ecosystems. Matt is an ecosystem ecologist. His research focuses on human causes of change in marine ecosystems. Most recently, Matthew has quantified the prey consumption and nutrient recycling services baleen whales provide to marine ecosystems. Fertilizing pelagic environments, whales embrace primary and secondary productivity and carbon storage. He is currently a National Science Foundation postdoctoral research fellow at Hopkins Marine Station at Stanford University. He's also a visiting researcher at the National Museum of Natural History, Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in ecology at the University of California, Davis, has worked as a science policy fellow for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Welcome, Dr. Savoca.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
It should. This looks it. This looks like it. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here this afternoon, this rainy afternoon, which is what we need. Hopefully we get some good rain today. And yeah, as Dan mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about some of the research that I've been doing here while as a postdoctoral researcher at the Hopkins Marine Station, right near the aquarium. And one of the main projects that I've been working on for a number of years now, we just recently published these findings, was using a bunch of field measurements to actually try and quantify how much food large whales eat and the effects that has on marine ecosystems. So, this is Whalefest after all, and I figured you probably know a lot about whales. This audience does anyway, but I always like to show what whales we're going to be talking about to orient us all to the animals we're going to be learning about today. And so this is the majority of the whales on our planet. The whales that are on the left side of the figure here facing to the right are the large baleen whales. Those are the large filter feeding animals. Those are the ones we'll be talking about. But as you notice, there's a bunch of smaller animals on the right facing to the left. And those are all the dolphins, the beaked whales, the killer whales, sperm whale, and so on. And yes, all dolphins are whales, but not all whales are dolphins. So there's two major groups of whales. There's the toothed whales, which are the whales on the right side of the panel, and the larger baleen filter feeding whales, which are the whales on the left side of the panel. And so what I'll be talking about today are the largest of the baleen whales, the blue whale, the fin whale, this is an Antarctic minke whale. This is actually one of the smaller, does this thing work? Oh yeah, look at that. This is one of the smaller baleen whales. It's still about the size of a small bus, so they're pretty large, even still. Broodies whales, they're the only real tropical baleen whale, the whale that just stays in the tropics the whole time of all the baleen whales. Most of the other baleen whales forage in the northern or southern hemisphere at higher latitudes, and they give birth in the tropics. But the Broodies whale, this one in pink here, they actually spend their entire lives in tropical waters, which is fairly unusual for baleen whales. Humpback whales, which we're probably all quite familiar with, they're extremely common out here in Monterey Bay, particularly in the summer. And bowhead whale. These are the whales that we studied in our research here that I'll talk about today. And it's about half the species of living baleen whales in the world. So just to orient you to the size of these animals and how they feed, I have this video here. This was from a whale watch that I was lucky enough to be on. I'm on the top deck of this boat here. This is the Monterey Bay Whale Watch's boat, the Blackfin. It's a 65-foot catamaran vessel, just to kind of orient you to the size of the whale in the frame here. And this is a blue whale in, I think it was 2017. So this whale's probably about 80, 85 feet long. That's an adult animal in the North Pacific. And they feed in this most spectacular way. Oftentimes they feed at depth, but this individual was feeding at the surface this day, which is quite unusual. But it allowed for us to get a really amazing footage of how these animals actually feed by taking in huge gulps of water, prey-laden water, in this case krill. Blue whales only eat krill. And then they filter that water out through baleen plates. And the way baleen plates work is they kind of look like Venetian blinds when they're closed, and there's little frills or fringes on the inside of the plate, so the inside of the mouth. And that kind of acts like a coffee filter, in the same sort of way as the coffee grounds are kept behind and the coffee pours through. Same thing with the water and the krill. And so after the animal takes a large gulp, like you saw there, a blue whale will take about a minute or so to filter that water before swallowing all that prey down. And this individual is foraging at the surface, so they can breathe while they're doing this, but most oftentimes these animals are foraging in waters about 300-400 feet deep. And so they take these enormous gulps of water, do all this filtering, and they'll do this 4 to 6 times per dive. And so it's really impressive, just the physiology that needs to happen to really enable this type of very unusual feeding behavior. And so a basic, sort of building block of how animals live and how they affect ecosystems is how much food they require. And this is important not just for the animal themselves, but also for how the ecosystem responds to different numbers of, in this case, top predators like whales, how much prey is needed to actually support those animals in these systems. And so this is kind of a basic fact about the biology of any given animal. How much food do they need to eat? And for most animals, we know this information by direct observation, right? But for whales and for other large predators, particularly large marine predators, we can't actually film them or observe them as they're actually eating in most cases. So even though before this work there was lots of estimates for how much food whales ate, it ended up being primarily based on metabolic extrapolations. What I mean by that is an animal that's warm-blooded like us, we know how much food we need, and if you scale up our metabolism to the metabolism and size of a large whale, if you just kind of work that trend up to an animal the size of an airplane, that's how much they would have to eat. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but in other words, they were just guesses. They were never actually measured before. But by and large, all these different sources that I dug into suggested that on any given day, which these whales are feeding, they'll eat somewhere between 2 and 5% of their body weight per day. There's a couple interesting points to note here. Number one is this is about what people eat per day, and this is also what these studies would suggest whales eat per day. But an important difference there is baleen whales don't eat every day of the year. In fact, they don't eat most of the days of the year. Baleen whales only eat about 100 or so days a year, give or take. That's still up for debate. We don't know exactly how many days a year they eat. But what we do know is that most of the year they're actually not eating, they're fasting, which is quite unusual for a warm-blooded animal that doesn't hibernate. In fact, besides the baleen whales and the elephant seals, which also have a similar life history, I don't actually know of any other warm-blooded animals that don't hibernate that have this type of strategy. Because there's a lot of costs, metabolic costs, associated with just being alive if you're a warm-blooded animal, to maintain your body temperature, maintain your bodily functions, and so on. And it's not like these whales are sleeping when they're not eating. They're migrating, they're breeding, they're lactating, they're doing lots of energy-intensive things, and they're doing that all based off of stored fat that they get from the food that they eat only about 100 days of the year during our summers. So when I realized that there was sort of this large gap in our knowledge for example, something as basic as how much food do these large whales require, I realized that we have the data now to actually address this question with field measurements. So that was the first question that we wanted to know. Secondarily, I wanted to know not just, of course, whales eat a lot, right? That's not particularly surprising, but I wanted to know what is the impact of this type of prey consumption on the marine environment, which whales are top predators in. And finally, I wanted to know if, especially in the case of 100 or 200 years ago when there were far more whales than there are today, and we'll talk about this, how could an ecosystem support 10 times more whales than we have today and still have the same amount of other organisms living in that ecosystem as well? Something has to give. Presumably there was more productivity in those systems, and if so, did whales actually help sort of structure that productivity and structure their ecosystems just by being there and living their lives? And we'll talk about how they do that as well. But to first address this question, we used a suite of emerging technologies that I work with Jeremy Goldbogen's group at the Hopkins Marine Station, and a bunch of us together have been using all these different technologies and combining them to learn about the lives of whales. So the primary technology that we use are tags. These are tags that are attached primarily by suction cup to the backs of whales at sea, obviously. And here's an example of one of our lab mates, Dave, putting a suction cup tag on a blue whale here in Monterey Bay. And then those tags kind of act like a Fitbit or like your iPhone, and they can tell you how many, in this case, how many mouthfuls of food you take in a day. So our iPhones, for example, can take our data from an accelerometer, the same type of sensor that are on these tags. But for us, we're curious about how many steps did we take in that day, or how many flights of stairs did we climb, something like that. For the whales, of course, they would have trouble climbing stairs, but they are, of course, eating a lot, allow us to do that. The second thing we had to know, of course, is because these whales are eating large, swarming prey, we wanted to know the size of the mouth. Because if we know how many times they take a mouthful, that's, of course, important, but we need to know the size of that mouthful to get an idea of how much food is in each gulp. So we use drones to do that. I'll explain that a little later. And finally, we actually wanted to measure the density of those prey swarms in which the whales were feeding. So to do that, we used an echo sounder, which sends a pulse of sound into the water, and we listen to the returning echoes, or the instrument listens to the returning echoes, and then it converts that into a density of prey in that swarm where the krill or fish where the whale is feeding on, right? And this is very much like a fish finder. Like if you have one of those boats and you're going fishing, it's kind of like that, but just higher resolution, but same technology. So as I mentioned, this is a very large project with many collaborators across a variety of institutions. Anytime you're working with large pelagic animals, you can't do it alone, and oftentimes you do it in large teams. So this work was a combination of folks primarily at Stanford, Duke, UCSC, NOAA, and others that were involved in all different aspects of this project. So this is a kind of a weird acknowledgement slide in the middle of the talk, but just to remind everyone that, yes, I am presenting on this work, but this work involved dozens of people around the world over the course of many years. To show where those data came from, though, again, the color scheme is the same as when I first showed the whales. Sorry for the scientific names. I took this from a scientific talk I gave not too long ago, but you see where in the world these whale tags were put out and on what species they were put out. So the vast majority of our data, particularly on humpback blue and fin whale, are from the eastern North Pacific, off the coast of California primarily. We also have a fair amount of data, and more so every year, from the Antarctic, particularly the western Antarctic Peninsula. Data from the Atlantic Ocean as well, off the coast of South Africa, and in the Gulf of Maine. We also have other tags, some from Greenland, some from the Azores in the tropical North Atlantic. So this is a data set that comprised of over 300 deployments of those tags onto different whale species, 7 different species, all around the world over the course of 10 years. So a lot of this data was being collected long before I started in Jeremy's lab. So this is a long-term project that I was lucky enough to come in and use all this data to gain some insight into how these whales live their lives and affect the ecosystem. So we talked about the tags a little bit, but now the drones, actually this is first the tagging you actually see there. That's us putting a tag on a blue whale, also in Monterey Bay. So if anyone wants to see a blue whale, I think Monterey Bay is one of the best places in the world to do so, in part because the blue whale population in the eastern North Pacific is one of the healthiest blue whale populations anywhere in the world, and also because the proximity of where humans live and where these whales are going to be, they're not super remote. It's easy for us to get to them, relatively speaking. So there are other places in the world where you could see blue whales, but they're far harder to get to. The California coast, and particularly Monterey, in August, September, and October, are some of the best places, I think the best place in the world, actually, to see a blue whale in the wild. So anyway, so this is us putting a tag out on a blue whale, and as you see, this is roughly what the tag looks like. I should have brought a tag now that I think of it. Well, in any case, this is about the size of the tag, and I just call it a whale iPhone. All the sensors that your iPhone has, these tags have. And what makes them basically special is that they can ride on the back of a whale, go in salt water, and go into depths of 1,000 feet of water or more if they have to. So that's really what makes them special. The technology is not particularly new, but enabling it to be used in a marine environment, riding on the back of an animal, is pretty special. And then once that tag is on the whale, we not always, but often, whenever we can, we try to measure the whale. We do that using airborne drones. And over the course of this project, we've measured hundreds of whales. And so we have a really good sort of idea now of how large these whales are in different ecosystems. One of the things that was interesting to me when we were starting on this project, or when I was putting all this data together, is these are some of the first measurements of living whales that we have in terms of their size or their body structures, things like that. So there's lots of measurements of whales from back in the day, but almost all of them are from dead whales that were killed at whaling and killed and brought to whaling stations and then were measured at whaling stations. So all those different dimensions, the size, the weight, the things like that, the things that we hear about, spectacular dimensions of blue whales, for example, those are all from animals that have been killed. These are among the first sort of large catalog of living whales in terms of the measuring living animals, which is pretty cool. What we can do, though, when we measure, for example, the size of the living animal, is we can relate that to what we know about the different perspectives of the different body structures. So if an animal is X meters long, you can relate that to how big the engulfment capacity is, how big that throat pouch is. And their relationships work out really quite well. And a lot of these mathematical relationships were initially worked out by whalers at whaling stations or scientists that worked at whaling stations, such that we can just measure the length of the animal and actually have a really good guess as to how big that engulfment capacity is. And so this work, or this part of the work, was led by a PhD student, now a postdoc, Sherelle, and that's how we use the drone measurements to figure out how large the mouth was. And so just to give you an idea of what data we look at, so we're, of course, as the scientists, more interested in these panels down here, but it's always fun to give a sort of show as to what we see from the tags. This is a blue whale in Monterey Bay. And yeah, so a lot of times we learn about really fascinating behaviors, including social behaviors that these animals have that we didn't know about before. So this blue whale is actually feeding in a pair. And so we have some research looking at how these pairs are related, how they work together cooperatively, because it wasn't really known that blue whales ever sort of were social on the foraging grounds, but it seems like they are quite frequently, actually. So yeah, you can actually see the krill flying by there on the camera lens. And when this whale takes a gulp of prey-laden water, it actually, in terms of the volume, the entire volume of the animal, it gets to be about twice its original volume. So that's how large of a bolus of water they can take in. They really get to be this strange tadpole shape. And this video goes on for a while, and that whale on the top there, they both took a big gulp of water, but you can see this whale is still filtering out that large gulp of krill-laden water that it had. But again, primarily what we use are these outputs from the tag's sensors. This is a really nice example of a video, obviously, of a feeding event, but we can actually now tell, since we've seen it so often, there's a lot of really characteristic sort of responses in the sensors of these tags when the whale is doing a certain thing, like a breach or a turn or taking a mouthful, things like that. In fact, one of the students in the lab right now is working on a really cool project where when these whales are sitting still, you can actually use the tags, which are extremely sensitive to any small form of movement. You can use the tags to measure the heart rate of the whales because they can actually detect the heartbeat of the whale if the whale is just floating still. And so he's working on a project where we're looking at all the different heart rate data we can get from these tags. So there's lots of rich information that we can get about how these whales are living, behaving, and everything that you can imagine it's really opening up a world of discovery for us. So it's been quite fun. But when you put those data records together for each of these individual deployments, and again, remember we have hundreds of these, but this is just what one looks like, for example. This is a blue whale tagged in 2011 in Southern California. And what you'll notice is that in the late afternoon, it's feeding at about 150 or 200 meters. So that's about 500 feet of water, give or take. And then as day turns to twilight and night, it follows this prey layer as the krill moves up, so krill vertically migrate in the water column. And during the daytime, they bunch up and hang out several hundred meters below the surface. And then as day turns to night, a lot of these krill and other small forage animals come up to the surface when it's safer at night to do so. And you can actually see the whale following this vertical migration of their prey as day turns to night. And this is a fairly typical pattern that we see. Usually the whales that are in our area that we're tagging, they're feeding pretty much constantly throughout the day, sometimes for 15 hours straight, taking breaks to breathe, but otherwise just being down wherever the prey is at that time. And then at night, they are resting most of the time. They're either digesting, socializing, singing, things like that. It's a pretty regular pattern that we see when whales are here in Monterey Bay or anywhere off the coast of California, which is their feeding ground, their summer feeding grounds. But just to give you an example, that was most of our tags are on for in the order of a couple hours to a day or two. But we do work with other collaborators from the Cascadia Research Collective, which is a NGO based out of Washington. But they do work on whales all over the North Pacific. And they put on tags that stay out for days to weeks. And so what I'm showing you here is a tag that was put out on a blue whale in 2017, I believe. 2017. And each one of these panels here, this is a day. And so these dark bars here, these are the nights. So you got day, night, and so on. And each one of these red dots is a feeding event or a gulp. And so what this shows is that when these whales have hit a good patch of food on their feeding grounds, they can feed for, in this case, looks like about 3 weeks straight. They do take breaks at night most of the time, but not always. So you see this day here, this whale was actually feeding at night. And so most spectacularly to me here, it seems like in this sort of 2 to 3 day period, this whale basically fed for about 36 hours straight. But again, remember, that's because they'll take days off from eating while they're on the feeding grounds if they just haven't encountered a good prey patch or if they want to move from one area to another or socialize or do anything like that. And then also during the non-breeding or during the non-feeding season or the breeding season, which is our winter, they won't eat at all for months. So yes, they can eat and they do eat for hours and sometimes days straight when they hit good food, but remember they make up for that because they don't eat for days, weeks, or even months at a time during other parts of the year. And yeah, there's lots of sort of ramifications to that very unusual feeding strategy, which is if their food is very ephemeral and they have to hit their food at the right time, there's effects of climate change and ship interactions and things like that because it's not as though if they miss their food, they can't always make up for it the next day or the next week or the next month. So they're potentially quite susceptible to human modifications of the environment because they're foraging on such ephemeral and patchy prey. But to get back to the original question, we were curious about how much these whales ate total in a given day. And so the last major piece to this puzzle that we had to fill in was how dense are those swarms of krill that these animals are feeding on. And there's a lot of surveys that have measured krill or different types of forage species in the environment, but they do so at really big spatial scales. So this is a large NOAA ship, the Shimada, which sometimes we see out here in the bay actually. They do oceanographic surveys up and down the coast. And it'll measure roughly how much krill is in the environment, but at really large spatial scales that aren't super relevant to a foraging whale. So what we had to do instead was actually look at this in higher resolution. And the only way to do that is with a much smaller boat with much higher, basically, resolution echo sounders to look at the density of prey patches. And so if you remember those little squares in the previous slide, those are about 10 by 10 kilometer squares. This, by comparison, is a slice of Monterey Bay, this slice right here, and it's about 15 kilometers. So it's like the same sort of spatial scale. And within that spatial scale, you see the patchy nature of the prey here. These are krill patches across that slice of ocean. And what you notice is these little red patches, those are the krill swarms that these whales are going to be interested in foraging on. And so in other words, if you imagine averaging out, this is a little math, hopefully I don't mess up or get people too nervous about this, but in any case, if you average out the krill across this entire swath, what'll happen is you'll have a really low average value, but that's not relevant to the animal. What's relevant to the animal are these really, really high patches that are just random, not randomly, but sort of spread out patchily through the region, and that's what the animal is interested in. And this work primarily was led by Dave Cade, who just finished his PhD in Jeremy's lab. And we actually took out a small boat and measured the density of these prey patches, again, this work led by Dave primarily, to measure the density of the krill in these patches that the whales were actually feeding on. This hadn't been done before, because it's hard to do, and in fact, when we got these instruments, the makers of these instruments told Dave that you're not supposed to put these on small boats, so please don't do that. They're supposed to be on big oceanographic research vessels. And I said, okay, and did it anyway, but because they're really sensitive and really expensive, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but to actually get the data that we needed, you couldn't do it from a large boat. The large boats aren't nimble enough to measure these fairly small patches. And I say fairly small, they're still about the size of a football field or several football fields, but they're too small for a large, several hundred meter research vessel to accurately measure. But these small boats can do that. So when we did that, we were able to actually turn these krill densities into numbers of like biomass in terms of the amount of krill per cubic meter of water in that patch that the whale was foraging on. Data informed estimates for how much these whales are eating on a given day. So in the top here you have blue whale, fin whale, and humpback whale from primarily the eastern North Pacific, but also the North Atlantic. And then here we have humpback whale and minke whale from the Antarctic. And you'll see on the x-axis here, this is how many tons of prey, krill, these are all krill feeders here, that they ate per day. And a small minke whale, again about the size of a school bus, a small bus, would be eating about a ton a day, maybe a little less, whereas blue whales off our coast here could be eating as much as 10 to 20 tons a day of krill. That's just one animal. And so previous estimates that just used guesses for how much these whales eat, that's what these brackets represent. So our numbers were in the range, but on the upper end. And this is on a daily scale, remember, too. A lot of the estimates were estimates based on how much they eat per year, whereas we were measuring on the daily scale. So there's reasons why our estimates might be incongruous, but we primarily found that on the daily scale, these whales eat much more than we thought per day than previous estimates would have assumed. So for me, as an ecosystem ecologist, that was, of course, interesting, but I wanted to know how that actually ripples out to effects on the ecosystem overall, and how might we actually test that or quantify that. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, we did a uncontrolled experiment in the world's oceans, and what I'm talking about is whaling. We removed almost all of the large whales from the ocean, particularly the Southern Ocean, in a really short period of time. And over that time, the oceans changed quite dramatically. And so one thing that we can do is we can take our current estimates for how much whales eat per day, and then we can extrapolate that out, say if each whale requires this much food, but there were this many whales in the past, what does that tell us about past ecosystems and how productive they must have been to support this many whales? This is a picture of a blue whale from the Antarctic. The Antarctic has the largest, or had the largest, blue whales. This is one of those extremely large animals, probably a 90-foot individual. This is in South Georgia, which is a really amazing island in the South Atlantic. It's where Shackleton was rescued, if anyone is familiar with that story. But anyway, this is a really important whaling port in the early 20th century, South Georgia Island. And if you look at whaling numbers, the other thing that's really spectacular about the whaling records is the data they kept is wonderful. It's so rich, and so you can go back and sort of do this historical ecology based off of the whaling numbers that all the stations reported in these different ocean basins. And so for humpback whales, you'll notice this trend across. I'll show a couple different species, but you'll notice this trend in that in the northern hemisphere, we depleted whale populations, but not nearly as much as we did in the southern hemisphere. We also depleted those populations earlier, because the southern hemisphere just were more remote and harder to get to. These are the oceans around Antarctica. What happened really in Antarctica was a perfect storm of the technology improving to the point where we could go down there and harvest every whale there really, really quickly. And so it created this incredible press on the ecosystem that was not as obvious in the northern hemisphere. So this is a humpback whale plot. This is a fin whale plot again. You see we hunted, these pink bars are how many individuals we hunted per year. So this would represent 10,000 individuals per year, this right here. But if you notice in the southern hemisphere, we're talking about a completely different scale entirely. So here, this would be 60,000 individuals hunted per year, right? And so, yeah, so we really rapidly reduced, in this case, fin whales in the southern hemisphere. Before whaling, there were over 500,000 fin whales in the Southern Ocean. After whaling, there was about 5,000. So we reduced fin whales by about 95 to 98% in the Southern Ocean, which is by far where the most whales were as well. And then blue whales, which is probably the saddest story of all the big whales and how we hunted them. We hunted them to almost extinction in the North Atlantic. The North Pacific, not entirely, and that's probably one of the reasons why our North Pacific blue whales are doing, relatively speaking, fairly well. But in the southern hemisphere, there were over 300,000 blue whales in the southern hemisphere. By comparison, currently today on the entire planet, there's about 20,000 blue whales. So in the southern hemisphere, there was over 300,000 in the waters around Antarctica. And in about 40, 50 years, we harvested them from over 300,000 to under 1,000. So that's a reduction of about 99.8 or 99.9%. And ironically, so the economics drove this unsustainable exploitation of these animals. Same thing with fisheries, right? I mean, if there's no regulations, then humans are just going to hunt animals until they can't be hunted anymore. The great irony, of course, there is that it's economics that also saved the last whales because they were no longer economically viable to catch. They couldn't find them anymore. But there were still some around, very few, but still some around. And so as a result, blue whales are recovering, and fin whales in the Southern Ocean, just very, very slowly because they were almost completely extirpated from that area. Also, again, interestingly, you see how humans hunted these different species over time. This is from the Southern Ocean again. And you notice we hunted the largest species first because they were the most profitable. And so this is blue whale. So we hunted out almost all the blue whales, primarily in the 30s and 40s. Then we hunted fin whales. That's these two red peaks. And as you notice, there's a huge gap here in whaling in the 1940s. And that's because all the ships were decommissioned and used for the war. So we hunted almost no whales during World War II. But then we picked it up after World War II and extirpated almost the fin whales entirely. These are sei whales, which I haven't spoken about. They're in between the size of a humpback whale and a fin whale. They're pretty large, 50 feet long. And I think this is the most impressive bout of exploitation. We basically wiped out about 250,000 fin whales, about 250,000 sei whales in about a decade. This is a really impressive feat of destruction that we did in the Southern Ocean. So, and then sperm whales. Sperm whales were hunted for many hundreds of years, but they were also hunted in the Southern Ocean as well. And then finally, minke whales. These are the small guys, and they were hunted last because they were least profitable. And then finally, the moratorium. So you could not allow whaling anymore. And that actually ended up saving all the whales down there. Otherwise, they probably all of it would have been hunted to extinction or close to extinction. So this is the minke whales, that smaller whale. Again, about 3-4 meters long, so like 10, 15 feet long. And they were not hunted until about 1970. And then they were started to hunted fairly intensely, but then the moratorium came into effect in 1982, and they were no longer hunted, at least not at an industrial scale. But as I was mentioning, the thing that I found exciting about these data is combining them with the estimates of how much food these whales eat on a given day, and then looking at how many whales there are now and there used to be. So this top plot is a prey consumption of the entire population of Antarctic minke whale, humpback whale, fin whale, and blue whale. And what you notice is, and this is a log scale, this is how much krill they ate per year in the Southern Ocean for the entire population of these four species. So there's not much difference in how much krill minke whales ate before whaling and after whalings, because we didn't kill very many of them, relatively speaking. Whereas there's a huge difference in how much krill blue whales ate before and after we hunted them all out, just because there were so many fewer of them, right? That's all this is really showing here. And why does this all matter anyway? The reason is because the polar ecosystem, particularly the ecosystem around Antarctica, is changing rapidly. We've noticed declining productivity in these systems, particularly from the mid-20th century to present. And the question is, what is driving this change in productivity in the system? Climate change certainly has something to do with it, but there is this thought that actually the removal of whales had diminished productivity in these large ocean systems. And we see this, oddly, in the data for how much krill there is around Antarctica. So this is a paper that came out in 2004, and it analyzed all the krill data, basically measurements of how much krill there was around all of Antarctica. This is what all those whales eat down there. And in the 1970s, when all the whales were hunted out and the moratorium came into effect, the expectation was that krill was going to explode in terms of how much krill there was. And the reason for this is because whales were and are by far their largest predators. And so if you remove the predators, presumably the prey should increase in numbers and increase in abundance. But that's actually not what happened. The data show quite strongly that krill numbers have crashed, particularly in the area where the most whales were removed. this area south of South America, in the years and decades post-whaling. This phenomenon is considered somewhat of a paradox. The krill paradox is, why has this ecosystem changed so dramatically and reduced in productivity after all the whales were removed? It shouldn't have worked that way. And one way that we know that there had to have been more krill in the past, because as you see before, there were no measurements before the mid-1970s. So it's a mystery how much krill there was in the ocean before the 1970s, before we could measure it. But one way that we can do that is with some historical sleuthing, where we can say, okay, if we know how much these whales need to eat, and then we know how many whales there were, we can just back calculate how much krill there had to have been. It's not incredibly precise, but it's better than nothing. And right now there's no other data out there for us to know exactly how much krill there were. And to put all this consumption into perspective, in the blue line here, I did a plot of, for those 4 species of whales that we were talking about, how much krill they ate per year in the Southern Ocean. And this is all of global fish catch in the world's oceans, which we've been tracking since 1950. The FAO has been tracking since 1950. And so what you see is that the whales just in the Southern Ocean were consuming more seafood than all of humanity until about 1965. And I mean, yeah, compare this, like this is all of world fisheries, and this is just whales around Antarctica. So the scale is unbelievable. It's hard to fathom how important and how, the size of the effect that these animals had on the system, on the planet, before we killed most of them. And so this enabled us to think about this idea about what if whales are actually enabling more productivity in their systems. And so this is something known as ecosystem engineering. So animals are able to modify, maintain, or create habitat by modulating the availability of resources to other species. This is a phenomenon that had been known well before whales, but hadn't really been extended in this way to the largest whales, at least not with these data before. Beavers are a great example of this. When they cut down trees and make their dams, they create ponds. They create new habitat and new environments, new ecosystems that wouldn't form if the beavers weren't there. But there's been some discussion before our work that whales, in their eating, but also in their pooping, recycling those nutrients in the upper water column actually enabled more productivity in the system. And so we were able to actually sort of measure that for the first time ever. And this is a phenomenon known as the whale pump, which is this idea that animals like fish, krill, squid, eat phytoplankton, eat primary production. Those are marine plants. And then they'll vertically migrate up and down. They'll store those nutrients inside their bodies, inside the fish, krill, and squid bodies, where they mainly stay locked in those bodies unless they have an animal that eats them and then converts them into fertilizer feces. And that's what these whales do. And this is a phenomenon that was first described in the 2010s with whales in the northern hemisphere. But we now have actual measurements of whales, pooping. And I figured I would show one to you today. This is a fin whale right off here. This is recycling some really wonderful krill nutrients. And the point here is, and this is weird, right? People are like, oh my God, it's poop, it's weird, it's wild. Okay, but think about this. Before the mid-20th century, every bit of fertilizer that humanity ever used was some form of animal feces or decaying organic matter, right? Every single bit. And in 1909, we had the capability, a couple chemists, a couple German chemists, first enabled us to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into something that plants could use, fertilizer. That's synthetic fertilizer. Almost all the fertilizer we now use, particularly at the industrial scale, is synthetic, meaning it's made in labs and in factories. But before 1940 or so, almost all of human history, we fertilized our crops, we bolstered our populations, we fed our nations with animal poop fertilized feed. That's just what we did. We actually went to war in the 1800s over guano deposits. Those are large seabird poop deposits on islands off of South America. Bird poop was worth more than gold by weight in the mid-1800s. So this is, it seems weird and wild, but it really shouldn't be. I mean, this is what we did for millennia before we were able to actually create our own fertilizer in the mid-20th century. In any case, oh, this slide didn't really work out, but the point here is that we were able to look at how much nutrients, in this case iron, which is the limiting nutrient in the Southern Ocean, how much iron is recycled in whale poop before and after whaling. And again, the same sort of pattern emerges here where when we removed the largest whales, we also removed these large inputs and subsidies of fertilizer to the system. That could have, in part, explained why the system productivity collapsed in the 20th century after whales were removed, which, remember, is not what people had expected, at least initially. Yeah, so historically and in current, and in particular, the fin whales and the killed by around 1960 or so. Yeah, and so there's lots more work that we're doing on this. Obviously, happy to take questions from anyone. We just recently published this work, so if anyone wants to read more about it, happy to send the paper along. There's been some good media coverage on it as well. But yeah, just obviously many thanks to lots of collaborators and funding agencies. And also, there's my contact information if anyone wants it. But yeah, if I have time, I'm happy to take questions. Do I have time?
You do.
Okay.
Earlier you said that the whales only spend about 100 days eating.
Yeah.
How much time do they spend sleeping?
Yeah.
You said there was some socializing.
Yeah, so when they're feeding, they do not eat at night most of the time. Sometimes they eat at night if the prey is dense enough, if the moonlight is bright enough where they can presumably see. There's still some debate as to why they forage on certain nights, but most nights, even when they're feeding here in Monterey Bay, they're not feeding at night. Now, that's also when they're singing a lot. They sing a lot at night. But there's presumably some sleeping in there as well. We don't know anything about how they sleep, really. So just recently, Jeremy and a bunch of his colleagues put on the first heart rate sensor for these whales. So we have an idea of how fast their heart beats. But even just these basic things of when do they sleep, how much do they sleep, neurologically, what are they doing when they're sleeping, we don't really know. There's some cool work, though, that's going to come out about elephant seals and how elephant seals sleep at sea. And I kind of consider elephant seals as like a proxy for the large whales because their life history is quite similar in many ways. But we don't know how they sleep. They must sleep. We know they do sleep, but we don't exactly know how and when and, yeah, how it works. Yeah, a lot of basic biology about the large whales is unknown, which is really cool as a scientist, but perhaps surprising. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned during the day the krill rise to the top, and the whales know to go up. How do they know that? How do they?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. One of the questions that we always get is how do they know where to find food? And that's a question that is really complex because it operates on a bunch of different spatial scales. When they're tracking their prey on the course of the day, they are so commonly visiting that prey patch. It's not like they take several hours off. They only take a couple minutes off to breathe and recover at the surface, and they go right back down. And so that pattern that you were seeing where the whale tracks its prey up to the surface, that's happening over the course of 6-7 hours. So they're basically going back to the same spot, and then the krill goes up slowly and slowly and slowly. So that's presumably some form of short-term memory. I'm just going to go right back to where I was. I know there was good food there, and now it's 5 feet further to the surface, and then 5 feet. So that's a sort of I guess it's a fast change over the course of as far as overall changes, but it's really slow in terms of how these whales are operating. So presumably that's just a short-term memory thing. What we don't know, though, is how they find these patches. So I showed that picture of these different patches and how sort of widely distributed they are across the ecosystem. What's less known is how they find those patches initially. But once they find those patches, they're really good at knocking them out when they're able to locate them. Yeah.
Yeah, I am a volunteer at Point Lobos, and we were told the whaling industry stopped in 1870 when kerosene came in. And I'm amazed that whaling kept going until 1982.
Yeah. So the whaling industry, I think that you're talking about with kerosene and all that sort of stuff. So that's sperm whales primarily. So sperm whales are these enormous toothed whales, about the size of a humpback whale, but very different. So sperm whales, they have this spermaceti in their head, which made great lighting oil because it burned with low smoke and was really bright. And so whales, sperm whales primarily, lit the world in the 17 and 1800s. until about the mid to late 1800s when whale oil was replaced by kerosene. Now, interestingly, as you mentioned, you were surprised to hear, and this is one of the reasons why I like giving this type of talk, almost all the whales that were killed after that time. And so, yeah. Now, most of that killing happened in Antarctica or the waters around Antarctica, so we're not as familiar with it. The question is, what do we do with all those whales, right? They didn't turn into lighting oil for the most part, or perhaps at all. So those whales primarily, and perhaps really sadly, turned into really marginal products. So margarine, car oil, industrial lubricants. In fact, a funny, well, it's not funny at all, it's a quite interesting anecdote from my car mechanic, who is an older guy and talks a lot. But that's okay, I talk a lot too. So we got to chatting, and because I was talking to him, he's like, what do you do for a living? I was talking about whales, whatever. And he was like, oh yeah, like there was whale oil in car, motor oil, for quite a while. And I was like, yeah, I heard about that. He's like, that's interesting because around the 1960s or 70s, is what he was telling me, around the 1960s or 70s, car transmissions were breaking a lot, like very regularly. And the reason is because these transmissions, apparently, according to him, were engineered to work well with this whale oil blend. And then when and the timing, when I didn't tell him anything about the timing of all this killing, but he was saying, around the 60s or 70s is when all these cars started breaking and whale oil was no longer in car oil. I was like, that makes sense because that's when all the whales were killed. The whales were basically gone by that point. So that's what, and like we turned their bones into animal feed. So we did, all kinds of stuff like that. We ate their meat to some degree. So Japan, there's all these interesting stories about what we used whales for in the 20th century, which again, particularly for baleen whales, is when the vast majority of baleen whales were killed. The vast majority of baleen whales were killed in the 20th century. And this is kind of amazing, right? Because my dad was alive when peak whaling, in the 1950s. It was like peak whaling. And it's not that long ago. So after World War II, no one would trade with Japan for a while. And so the United States basically told Japan to go to Antarctica and hunt whales to feed their nation. And so that's what they did from 1945, 46 until 1950 something. General MacArthur and the U.S. Army basically said, go to Antarctica and kill all these whales to feed your country. And that's what they did. So we used whales for a variety of purposes over the course of the 20th century when the vast majority of whales were killed. Now, here, this might be what Point Lobos was talking about, a lot of that killing happened earlier. So what they might be referring to at Point Lobos is this earlier whaling period. But in terms of globally, the majority of whales, particularly the majority of baleen whales, were killed in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Yeah. And not for oil, to light stuff. Yes, for oil, but for lubricants, motor oil, margarine. Margarine was a big one, which is just crazy and sad because obviously we are making margarine totally fine now. We just, it was just an easy resource to exploit. This is, anyway, I don't need to keep going, but happy to talk more though about this. As you can tell, I'm very energized about this point.
We'll invite you to Point Lobos to speak, okay?
Yeah, that'd be great. Totally. Yeah.
You mentioned the tags that you put on the whales last either a few days or the other group you said lasted up to a few weeks. What happens to them afterwards? I mean, they come off and what happens to them?
Yeah, so they come off, they float, and then they send off a GPS signal that we're basically notified that they're floating, but then we use VHF to actually get closer to them. So the VHF is you ever seen those biologists that are out with they're called Yagis? I don't actually know if there's is that the real word for it? I don't actually know. That's what we call it. But anyway, it literally beep, beep, beep. Yeah, it's like a directional beeping device. It's not very scientific, but. And so we use the GPS to identify where the tag fell off, roughly speaking, and then we take the boat to that general area and listen for the tag with the VHF. Now, sometimes the whales stick around. In fact, oftentimes the whales will stick around the general area because we tag them when they're not migrating, for example. But sometimes they'll take a tag and travel hundreds or thousands of miles. So there's this funny stories of our lab mate James, who was, I guess, the tag, he's like the tag cowboy in some ways. And he has these really interesting stories where Like a tag will pop off, 500 miles off the coast of Mexico, and he'll have to fly to Mexico, get on a boat, go out. It's just like crazy stuff. But that's pretty uncommon. Usually the tags pop off close to where we deployed them a day or two before, and we can just go get them. Yeah, and actually the recovery rate is quite good. We've almost never lost tags. So, and you do need to get them back. So, yeah.
Yagis were the name of the antenna, Yagi antenna.
There you go. I didn't know of Yagis. Yagi antenna.
It's like basic devices that are used for finding emergency locator transmitters.
Yep.
and such.
Yeah, they're very common in wildlife biology to track animals, and so I'm familiar with them. I just didn't know if there was like a better term than that. But, yeah, Yagi. Yeah.
You mentioned the Antarctic krill populations.
Mhm.
They're in decline. But what about the Arctic krill populations? Are they in decline as well?
Yeah. So I know less about those.
Okay.
And it's more copepod heavy up there than krill. They're similar type animals, but they're different. One of the interesting things that's happening in the Arctic, though, is as ice is melting and things are receding, glaciers, sea ice, things of that nature, we're actually seeing more productivity because there's more open ocean and there's more inputs of nutrients from melting ice into the ocean. How that's going to actually translate long term in the 21st century as we go to an Arctic Ocean with no ice, it's unclear, but at least in the short term, we're seeing higher productivity in the Arctic, and presumably that translates to higher copepod abundance, but I don't actually know I'm not entirely sure, but it's a great question. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just told today by a gray whale researcher that the gray whales up in the Bering Sea are doing more filter feeding for those increased krill up in the Arctic Ocean, whereas historically they have been on the amphipods.
At the bottom, yep.
Bering Sea.
Yeah. Yeah, things are changing rapidly at the poles, which is concerning for a lot of things, whales in particular, because they have to time their migrations. They feed in a very particular way. The gray whales actually are doing pretty well, though, at least so far. So hopefully that continues. Yeah. Yeah. Please, yeah. I can't believe we haven't talked about poop yet.
So if the whales don't eat every day, do they defecate every day?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We don't know much about their digestion and the frequency of defecation and so on. I would love to look more into that. One of the things that we did, so if you just look at the pressure difference, we think it's really hard for them to poop at depth, like actually challenging pressure-wise for them to poop at depth. So we think, and not only that, but if you look at their time budgets, they are diving a lot to eat, but they spend the vast majority of their time at the surface, whether it's breathing or singing or resting or socializing. They do most of that at the surface. And when I say at the surface, I mean in the top 20 to 50 feet. So they might actually be out of our sight, but not very deep is what I'm saying. In any case, we think they do most of their pooping at the surface, meaning in the top 50 feet of water or so. And that's important. Where they're pooping is really important because if it's going to be used as fertilizer, it needs to be in the photic zone. So if they're pooping very deep, it's not going to be super useful as fertilizer, but we don't think that's happening very much. But we have not been able to actually quantify where and when and how frequently they poop. That is actually something we'd love to do, but it's harder than you might imagine. Yeah. Yeah.
Some of the poop must float because I know there's whale researchers who collect poop from whales on the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a whale researcher who collects poop on the surface, actually. Every time we see poop, we try to collect it. We have a good specimen bank in our freezer now, and we're working with a student who's actually we'll be looking at the chemical composition of this whale poop and figuring out if and how it works as fertilizer in the ocean in a really intricate way that we're excited about. So, we also been looking for. Well, Lauren, who's in the back, has looked for microplastics in whale poop. So and seal poop, poop plastics extraordinaire. And so we love whale poop. It's a really useful sample. So whenever we see it, we always collect it. Yeah. Yeah.
Does whale poop or whale samples or blubber give you a better indicator of stress levels?
That's a great question. So how do you measure stress in a whale, right? And so if you think about the physiology of how the body works, if you have a stress response, right? Like if I scared you, or if you were just chronically stressed for a day, you would have different types of cortisol levels in your blood, in your fat, in your brain, and these different body compartments. And so the poop versus the fat can tell you different things at different time scales. So the poop would be something at a more immediate time scale, like were you stressed in the time when that food was being processed over the course of the last couple hours or days, something like that. Whereas what's in the fat might be more indicative of what was happening over the last couple of weeks to months when you were laying that fat down, right? One thing that's really interesting is, and something that we've been working on is baleen, the actual physical filtering structure, because they lay baleen grows like a fingernail, and so you can sample baleen along its growth axis, and you can look at stress over time. So you can see like, were they stressed this summer more than that summer or something like that? Or were they more at different time points in the animal's life? But in the absence of that, blubber would be a more longer term signal on the scale of weeks to months, possibly years, whereas poop would be more of a shorter term signal on the scale of what was happening in the last couple days or even hours. And people have looked at both, actually. One of the coolest whale studies regarding poop, and then I will stop talking about poop unless you ask me to talk more about poop, and I will, was after 9/11, researchers went out and collected poop from right whales in around Boston Harbor when there was like no ship traffic, no air traffic, no nothing after 9/11. And they saw a really, really stark decrease in cortisol, stress hormone, in the poop post 9/11, in the 3 days post 9/11 when there was no ship traffic, no air traffic, no nothing. Actually, some of the researchers we work with in Santa Cruz, they were doing this with blubber primarily, but they were looking at if whale stress decreased during COVID-19 when there was fewer everything, during particularly the lockdown, and it seems to be the case. That work is not out yet, but I think that's what I heard him saying, and it would make sense if that's the case. But yeah, so.
Well, now speaking of whale stress being decreased during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were literally bottlenose dolphins swimming along the Venice canals because there were no boats.
Yeah.
No boat traffic at all.
Yeah, these natural experiments are quite interesting. When something happens like 9/11 or COVID-19, you can actually see how the natural world responds to our change in group behavior is really quite interesting. So COVID was a great example of that. 9/11 was a great example of that. And we see some really unbelievable signals in the natural world as a result. Yeah.
One more quick question. Can you identify individuals from their feces?
Not from, well, actually, yeah. Presumably you could do genetics and actually, but that'd be a very expensive way to identify individuals, but probably. The best way to do is with photo ID of either the dorsal fin or the fluke. But presumably you could actually. I don't know of people who've done that, but they might be doing it for orcas actually in the southern resident killer whales, because I know they collect their poop a lot to do health assessments. So I would imagine that you could, but I don't actually know. But it would stand to reason that you could. Yeah.
So if you wanted to compare the metabolic rates of gray whales and baleen whales in terms of their feeding styles, is it better to compare a gray whale with the smallest baleen whale or with the biggest baleen whale?
Gray whales are really weird because it's a great question. How do you compare metabolic or like energetic requirements and outputs of gray whales versus the other baleen whales? Gray whales are kind of weirdos because they feed in really different ways. They feed in the benthos, they skim feed. I was just talking to one of the students in our lab about this, and anyway, if you want to, we should chat more because we don't know much about the energetics of gray whales, but we know a lot about the energetics of the gulp-feeding whales, like this humpback here behind me. But yeah, if you want to talk more about that, we have some people interested in the lab and doing that type of work, but we don't know very much about it. Yeah.
Time for one more question, if somebody has one.
All pooped out.
All pooped out. That was good. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Brilliant.